And I've been working in that area for the past 10 to 12 years. My first area of specialization is inclusive education, and that's what led me actually into Indigenous knowledge systems, because in Namibia, Indigenous people are quite excluded in terms of economic development, education, etc., etc. So yeah, that's where I am.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. Up to you, Dr. Stephen.
Yeah, my name is Stephen Wall. I'm a professor emeritus at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My background is in law, and I was hired to develop the Indigenous Liberal Studies program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Program is an interdisciplinary program, research focused, and for an art school, having a program like ours is kind of not within the norm. However, we've been able to put together a pretty good program over the years. We've participated in CIES and other conferences, and we've just kind of began to make a name for our program here in the United States.
All right, thank you for that. So I think we're going to just jump into the conversation. I just want to let the audience know that if you have questions, it's all about the conversation. So we don't have a kind of structure where it's a panel, PowerPoint presentation and things like that. So one thing we wanted to do is that your questions are going to type it in the chat, and I will be able to read them aloud. All right. That being said, something that I wanted to just make sure that we understand now is that for both of you, it's really interesting that both of you are working in Indigenous communities, and kind of, that's what your research is all about. So I will just get into the conversation and say, hey, how has COVID-19 affected the community where you live and you research and you focus your work on?
Well, the first thing was that COVID-19 came as a surprise to everybody, and that insisted on behavior change. We have two main Indigenous communities in Namibia, or at least those two that not labeled in a positive way, identified by the Ministry of Department of Indigenous Knowledge, or Department of Marginalized Community, it is called, because they've been identified as being marginalized. And those two communities are the San, they also have subgroups, and then you have Haihambo. Now, both these groups are mobile in nature. They are nomadic, maybe nowadays more semi-nomadic. And with COVID-19 coming in with lockdowns and not moving around and so on, that was the first thing that knocked the communities off. And then the Haihambo especially are cattle herders. They love their cattle, and they want to go where the cattle are and so on. And yeah, the behavior change of not shaking hands, not, social distancing, and so on and so on. And these in turn also had an impact. Their economic livelihood, the kind of jobs like Dr. Stephen earlier mentioned informally, that people depend on small jobs, going out and doing some jobs, and when the lockdowns came in, nobody moved out, and yeah. So for now, that's it.
All right, thanks. Dr. Stephen?
Well, when we look at what's happening with Indigenous communities in the United States, it's very, very hard to generalize. In the lower 48, not counting Alaska, there's about 250 or so tribal communities, some of which have reservations, some which don't. We also have an urban population that is equal to or greater than our reservation populations. And of course, these populations are located in ecosystems from the eastern seaboard of the United States to the desert areas of the Southwest to the Great Lakes areas, which is, very hardwood forest, deciduous forest, and then the mountains and western seaboard, which is like a rainforest. And so every indigenous group has different ecosystems. They have different land bases. So it's very, very hard to generalize. But there are a number of things that's happened, and I can speak to my experience personally as to what's been happening. And that is that, like the situation with the people in Namibia, a lot of changes because of social distancing, and a lot of concern over the children and a lot of concern over the elderly. We know that if the community was to come under a lot of coronavirus cases, that we would lose a lot of our indigenous knowledge that's held within our elders and has yet been passed on. We've had the tribe here at Haihambo has closed off all entrances into the community except for one or two actually, but there's tribal officers and police that man those, and only residents can come into the community unless you have a special permit. This has been going on since probably about early part of April. And Haihambo itself right now is free of COVID. We've, over the last 2 months, we've had 7 cases. However, another pueblo 15 miles away has had over 100 cases, which is about 10% of their population.
Wow.
And of course, with Navajo, they have, as of today, there's about 6,000 cases since this all started, for a population of less than 200,000 on the reservation. And so we can see that it's really affecting a lot of tribes, and a lot of tribes differently. Some are been really hit hard, such as Navajo and some of the pueblos here in New Mexico. On the other hand, some of the other tribes have not been hit quite that hard. But again, it's hard to generalize because of the wide variety of situations that Native people in the United States find themselves in.
Okay, got you. All right, thanks for that. And a question that I have for both of you is, how was information passed down to the people? Did they receive the information early enough to take all the preventive, approach that they needed to take? How was information shared down to the communities where you live and you work with?
In Namibia, I think the information was passed on early enough to all, although because COVID-19 is a new thing and one would benefit best from multiple sources of information. And where most of our indigenous communities live, they really mostly only rely on radio. So the information was limited to radio messages, of course, that were conveyed in indigenous languages and so on. But they didn't have the benefit of television, where they could really see the extent to which COVID is affecting the world. And they didn't see really pictures. But one of the interesting things that we all enjoyed was that in one of the indigenous communities amongst the Haihambo people, a parent was teaching their child about COVID-19. And that video is the one that was circulated, was shown on radio, was running on television, on how the father is asking the child, what is it that has affected the world? It's COVID-19. What type of disease? Or, the name bacteria, we realized does not even exist. So it was good that the media used a video of of a child in an indigenous community to convey the message on washing your hands and not playing too close to one another and so on. Yeah, but we think that people in the cities or towns rather had more information compared to indigenous communities, where they only limited to radio, and in some areas, for example, a lot of Haihambo live deep in the mountains, and they don't have even radio, access to radio, and cell phone, mobile networks, and so on. The Namibian government also introduced emergency social grant because of the economy that was shut down. And we picked up that a lot of people in these indigenous communities based, especially the San and also the Haihambo people, did not get the message of how to register, or some did not even get the message at all that they could register for the emergency social grant. Others got the message, but they did not have the means of registering because you had to use a cell phone to register and submit your application for emergency. So partly information went through, but not all information was accessed by all indigenous communities.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Stefan, yeah, go ahead.
I think that, again, like it's very, very hard to generalize. But most, being in the United States with the extensive, with extensive networks of broadcast news and cable news and social media and things of this sort, there's quite a bit of good information available to everybody on about COVID. What each tribe has done is hard to say. I'm not living out at Navajo, so I don't know on a day-to-day basis what happens out there or in any other reservation. Mm-hmm. I know that I know here at Hamas, the tribe has been really good. They send out written notifications. I think they had the 15th one this week. Came out yesterday describing what was going on, what the rules are for the community, because we go through the checkpoint, we go through curfews. They say how long it's going to last. They also talk about what the current rates are for COVID. And so we've had really good communications here where I'm at. I don't know that that's necessarily that true. I know that in the southern New Mexico, where I worked at one time on the Mescalero Patsy Reservation, mm-hmm. They're using social media for a tremendous amount of information and dispersion. And so, they'll take screenshots of executive orders and things like this that talk in terms of curfews and closures and things like that.
So one thing I'm hearing from both of you is that, let's say in Namibia, Dr. Haihambo, you were telling us that, the communication, the way the message was passed down based on where somebody was living, so people did not have all the information that they needed. And then one thing I'm hearing from you, Dr. Stevens, that, people were using social media. Will you say that, okay, before I go into that, let me just ask you, how has your community been affected? How have they been, if you compare to, let's say, Dr. Cynthy, if you compare to people who are living in the towns, compared to people who are in this community, how is the level of, infection? Can you compare it with the people who are living in the town? And how can you compare this, the level of infection as well, Dr. Stephen, between your community in Navajo, where you live and you work with, and the, let's say, the people who are not Native Americans?
We have a very low, for now we can say we have a low COVID-19 infection rate, because we have only 31 confirmed cases, and none of these cases are of people in indigenous communities. Most of our cases are imported, if for a lack of better words, by people who had traveled. And maybe because people in indigenous communities travel within their own communities and they do not leave the country. But we don't have an infection rate that is worrisome and that has affected them. But how they were affected is that the culture shock of having to practice social distancing and washing hands and not shaking hands, and also because people could not continue with their normal way of living through which they get means access to their basic needs. There were some cases reported even on the media of people that are going hungry because they cannot do their normal jobs. Some do sell small items that they make themselves, and but one big thing that affected them really is that there was no tourists coming through, because a lot of tourists go to the indigenous communities and they buy their items and they stay in hotels there, they invest in what they have there. And I mean, everything almost had come to a standstill for the 3 weeks that the country was on total lockdown. And now we are in stage 3, where we're easing up a little, opening up here and there, but still the country is locked for tourists, so nobody can come in and nobody can go out, except Namibians that are coming back home, or people who have been working in Namibia who are going back to their homes. So economically, definitely the impact was big, but as for infection rate, we are blessed.
Okay.
So far.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Stephen.
Well, how the community is affected. I mean, it's pretty subjective. First of all, here at Haihambo, being primarily an agricultural community, although so many people work off the reservation these days, almost everybody has access to agricultural land, even if it's very small. And what we find then is that during the quote lockdown, people still had access to outlets, such as going out to their fields and working, cleaning up, getting ready to plant and all that. Whereas if they were in the city, they wouldn't have that option. And there's people rebel against the idea of this lockdown that everybody's in. At the same time, we too are blessed that we have these options, that we don't have to be caught up inside our apartment all day long and not being able to get out. However, at the same time, the social distancing thing has been really hard on the community, and most indigenous communities worldwide are very, very close physically. And we like to touch each other, we like to hug each other, we like to go visit, we like to have ceremonial time. We like to celebrate life accomplishments. We mourn together. We have celebrations for marriages and for baptisms and for graduations, all of which have come to an end. And particularly for some communities here in the Pueblos and also in other places, I know that where I used to work at Mescalero, their puberty rights for the girls have been canceled for this year. That's my understanding, and I'm sure the same will be happening with large tribal celebrations across the United States. Some dances and tribal celebrations are not going to happen, and this is very, very hard on the culture. It creates an empty spot in the hearts of a lot of our tribal people. And so, we feel that loss, and we hope it's only going to be for this summer, because there's cultural things that need to be tended to, and regardless of what tribe we're in, there's cultural activities that need to be maintained and strengthened. And as long as we have to practice the social distancing to the level to prevent the transmission of the COVID virus, we end up having to compromise those activities. So those, but at the same time, we are blessed in the sense that we have outlets. I think most rural reservations have that same option, but not every reservation is rural, and not every native person or indigenous person in the United States lives on a reservation. So some of them are caught up in that, the urban lockdown.
And something that's really interesting to me is that what I'm hearing from you, that's good news, because when you read the news, specifically here in the US, you hear that, the indigenous community, the Native Americans have been really, really badly affected.
Well, we have. We have, because I was just looking at the Indian Health Service puts out numbers every week. And between June 3rd and June 10th, we had an 8.5 increase nationwide in the number of total number of cases, and a 7.9 increase in the number of new cases in that same time frame.
Yeah.
And like I said, Navajo has about 6,000 cases for a population of less than 200,000 on the reservation. State of New Mexico has 10,000 cases for a population of 2.5 million. And so we are getting hit a lot harder.
Yeah, that's true. And what could be, and then to both of you, I will be saying, like, what could be, maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Stephen, like, what could be the reason behind the community being hit harder than the general population?
Well, first of all, it's based in history, and it's been a long history. There's health disparities that have been around since ever since they've been maintaining statistics on health. And so indigenous people in the United States have higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, hypertension, all of those things that are considered killers. And it doesn't matter if you're reservation or urban, those are the kinds of things that those disparities exist. There's higher rates of violent crime, sexual assault, high unemployment, and there's a general lack of access to social services, housing, and even a part of this is access to capital for developing businesses and such. So that's one part of it's the disparities. I think the other part of it is the structural issues. Indian tribes entered into treaties with the federal government starting in the 1890s, I think, or maybe 1880s. And those treaties guaranteed certain things. And one of the things that was guaranteed was self-government. However, there's been a move in the last 30 or so years in the United States to change the perception that that relationship between tribes in the United States is not political, but it's more like a civil rights issue. And as long as we base our beliefs and and how we see ourselves in the treaties, we see that as a political relationship with the federal government. But over like I said, in the last 30 years, the United States Supreme Court has been trying to turn it away from being a political relationship to one of a minority to majority relationship. We have more rights under the political perspective, but what ends up happening is through racism, discrimination on state and federal levels, we've been chronically underfunded with Indian Health Service, and we have a clinic here at Haihambo that is doing quite well, but it's not doing as well as a similarly situated hospital or clinic in the city because of lack of funding. We have lack of funding for education, housing, all of those kinds of things. And of course, when you don't have money for housing, you have overhousing, overcrowding, and the kinds of things that lead to an easy spread of the coronavirus. I think that we can say that at Haihambo, the leadership is very proactive, and they came from a position of listening to what the doctors were saying and realizing that because of our high risk, because we have so many underlying conditions, that they had to make extraordinary steps to keep the community safe. That may not have been shared by a lot of other tribes.
Right. Thanks for that. What about you, Dr. Cynthy? I know you were telling us that, in your community, you were blessed enough to do not have many cases. So what could be the reason behind it?
I think, as I pointed out earlier, I think if our government had delayed to close the borders, the indigenous communities would have been hardly affected, because the tourists would have been in the areas where they normally reside, and the possibility of transmission then would have been high. But as for the socio-political issues that Dr. Stefan has mentioned, it's exactly the same. It's as if we are reading from the same notebook. The issues of marginalization and minority labels that are being used, and that put people from indigenous communities at a social disadvantage, that they do not access employment at the same rate as people from dominant groups. Even if they live within, they're not restricted to live in a particular area, but wherever they are kind of socially reminded, maybe subconsciously, that they are in a minority. They fall within a minority section. And the government is working very hard to undo that by even having created a department in the office of the vice president to address issues of marginalization. But as Professor Stefan said, it's a long history that really needs quite intensive efforts to address and redress. But there were kind of positive outcomes of COVID-19 on the communities, in a sense that when schools closed and everybody was locked down, people came back to the basics of sitting around the fire and sharing stories with children, and communicating. That transfer of cultural knowledge could happen because communities were together. And one issue that both groups, for example, had an issue with was that people were advised not to be more than 10 people in a particular dwelling, in a room, and so on. And both of these groups are really many in numbers. You have generations living within the same homesteads, like you have the great-grandparents and the grandparents and the parents and the children in the same household. So government have started reinforcing the message that except if you are all members of that same household and you do not allow other people from other households to come in, and they slowly started to get the message. But I like the idea of communities and families being together and sharing and spending time with each other, and sharing that cultural knowledge that is at the verge of being lost.
Okay. That's kind of one of the benefits that you saw with COVID-19. That's really good, because COVID-19 is not only bad, right? So they're kind of positive. I would like to follow up with you, Dr. Cynthy, to say, okay, many people who are in attendance right now don't know the historical background, because when you talk about, we like, hey, that's Namibia, that's Africa. So how come you have the same, historical, right, background that you find with the Native Americans here? So can you tell us a little bit more about the historical background, like the setting in Namibia, what happened to lead us to this stage?
Well, like most African countries, there were no borders before the borders came. So people were moving around whichever way. And then the borders, for example, the Haihambo people, for example, I have a map, but I'm not able to show it now. You find Haihambo people in Angola, and you find Haihambo people in Namibia, the side of the Kunene River. So before the borders, people were just moving across the two, across all spaces. And then came all the governments and centralization and decentralization and so on, and people were separated. But a lot of the indigenous communities, the benefit is, or a good thing that they have done is they have tried as far as possible to keep their culture, to maintain their culture. And while that is good, it also set them apart from others. For example, Haihambo are not very positive and accepting toward formal schooling because they want their children to head cattle and to learn to take care of cattle and homesteads and so on and so on. And here we come with education is compulsory from 0 to 16 and so on and so on. And that kind of created them being set aside. So although the government continue with efforts to draw them in, there is that conflict between what we want and what the rest of the country want for us. And there's always a question, especially in education, which is the area where I work, whose education is it that you are imposing? And when we look at the whole issue of formal education, we that has an impact on the rest of the things like employment and so on. If you have a low level of education, depending on our definition of low level, which is not necessarily a low level of education to the communities themselves, then you do not get into a job or you do not get to the university because you do not have a grade 10 or a grade 12 certificate. And so it is this whole historical aspect then coming in about what we regard as important and what the mainstream economy in mainstream Namibia think is important for us. So that created the issue of minority. For example, the San people, as I've said, are traditionally gatherers and hunters. And with nature conservation and sustainability of the environment, etc., they cannot hunt as per their tradition. So there's certain conservancies were developed for them to be able to continue with their traditional practices, but in a restricted manner. And these conflicts are always there. It's as if they just do not fit into whatever we have decided they should fit into.
Over, I just want to let the audience know that feel free to type in your question in the chat room, or if you want, you can just unmute yourself and let's say, raise your hand and say, hey, I want to ask a question, and then I will let you go on. So one thing I wanted to ask you both now is, looking at what you guys have experienced in your each communities, what do you think will be the best way? It's not that COVID-19 is behind us now. We know that's going to be with us for a long time based on what they're telling us. So what would you say will be the best approach for each individual community moving forward, not to see, like Dr. Stephen, you were saying, you know, this your community being as hit as it is right now, and how do you make sure that, you know, the information is passed down in such a way that, you know, we prevent that from happening?
I think one thing we realized with COVID-19 is that our structures are kind of directed at a particular way of doing things. For example, in education, we had a teacher present in the classroom and learners present, and there was this physical interaction. When COVID-19 set in, everybody resorted to e-learning. And we realized that we have not empowered our communities in terms of e-learning facilities and e-learning culture. So at the end of the day, children that are in towns benefited more from e-learning than those in the indigenous communities. And going forward, we have realized that we need to do more in terms of equality, in terms of resource mobilization and so on. Otherwise, we'll always have the issue of equity versus equality. And this became so clear during the COVID-19, that learners that could continue learning really are those learning the school syllabus, are those that are having access to e-learning. But on the other hand, as I've said earlier, these learners benefited a lot from those in indigenous communities and small communities without e-learning and so on and so on. They most probably have learned a lot about their traditional knowledge and cultures and so on. Unfortunately, who assesses that? At the end of the day, going back to school, there's a standard examination that does nothing to do with your indigenous knowledge, and everything is about what we call Western Eurocentric knowledge, that the children just learn, and when they're done with school, they drop it there and they continue starting living their real life.
Dr. Stephen?
Well, I think, unfortunately, well, let me go back and say something first. In some ways, for those of us who live in rural areas, I think that what Cynthy was saying about being blessed is really, really important, because we do have a lot of access to some, using our traditional knowledge and some of our traditional ways of food gathering and raising food and things of that sort. We still have that knowledge. On the other hand, and in that process, and the process that we've had to deal with now for the past couple of months in terms of lockdown and stuff like that, you begin to cut through those things that are really, really important, and those things are not important. And this has been a real good exercise in terms of figuring out what's really important in our lives and in our communities. Having said that, though, we have to look at the fact that here in the United States, the COVID-19 response has been tremendously politicized. And, you see it in terms of, people who wear masks and people who don't wear masks. And there's a political statement being made when you don't wear a mask. But unfortunately, that's also passed down to the tribes, and not so much internally, but this particular administration has not been supportive of Indian tribes as tribal governments. They've been trying to cut back on our ability for self-government. And so one of the ways they're doing that, first of all, is that when they first announced money under the CARES program for tribal governments, they didn't include tribal governments. It was money for state and local governments, but no money for tribes. And finally, some political people got involved and got money identified for tribes. And now the administration is dragging its feet in terms of releasing that money. And some tribes have not received anything. Navajo was able to get a bunch of money because they had such a high rate of infection, and they were in the news nationwide, and they had that kind of political pressure to use to get their money loosened up. But some tribes haven't received their CARES money yet. In addition, what we're finding also is that the federal government's telling the states not to share COVID information with the tribes, that we're not entitled to that information, whereas in previous administrations, we would have been at the table establishing, how the information is going to be gathered and how it's going to be used. And now all of a sudden we're told that we can't access that information for our own health planning. And so the political side of this is what needs to be dealt with, unfortunately. And I don't know if it's even possible, to be honest with you, because this is a very dangerous situation that our communities face. We do face the potential for losing a lot of indigenous knowledge through the loss of elders and the high death rates of older people, and our high rates of health disparities puts us particularly at risk. But at the same time, not only are we being attacked by the COVID, but we're also being attacked by our own government, which is trying to use this as a way to prevent our tribal communities from getting the resources they need to do their health planning and adequately prepare for the next steps. So this has been the unfortunate aspect of this.
Okay. Got you. We just have a question from the audience, a member of the audience who say, is it possible to get a link or access to the Navajo incident that was just discussed? I think it's to you, Dr. Stephen.
I don't know about any particular links. I think that you can check the Navajo website, Navajo Tribe's website, Navajo Nation, I think it is, Navajo Nation, Google Navajo Nation. They do have a special coronavirus page on their website, and so you can find that material through them. But they've also we're in the what's that called when you're in that area that's served. Our mass media here in Albuquerque serves a large portion of the Navajo reservation, so we have a tremendous amount of Navajo information on our local news sources, particularly television. And so we get to see what's going on over there. You know, with they've had lockdowns, they've had curfews, they have had all kinds of things. But for people living outside of this broadcast area, you probably don't see that very often. So I would just Google Navajo Nation, and you could even go Navajo Nation coronavirus, and you'll probably get the website that you need.
Okay, got you. So just to follow up on that, so just both of you were talking, I'm just wondering, and I'm guessing that some members of the audience are also wondering, like, how do we, what can people do? Let me put it this way, because now you're talking about, okay, not having access, right, to the resources that you need. So if you were talking to an audience, also ask, like, what can people do to help out? And to do, you, Dr. Cynthy, I was just kind of wondering, you were talking at the beginning that you know, the government put in some kind of social grant, and the people who could not get the social, did not even know how to apply, they were not even aware. So what can, if you were thinking, let's say you were part of a task force and you were thinking about how can people approach it, because we know that pandemics, I mean, epidemics, pandemic are going, it's not the first time. So kind of the lessons that we can learn from this and make sure that, you know, in the next time, next phase, when this happens again, that's part of life, I think. How best can we prepare ourselves for the next, you know, event that's going to happen? It may not be a pandemic, it may be a virus, but maybe something disastrous. So anyone can start.
I would say that for Namibia especially, we need to make sure that everybody has access to information locally, because it seems like the information is up there, and people in indigenous communities have to get the information from people who have access to the internet and who have access to television and so on and so on, if they do not hear this information over the radio. So what we're learning is we know what are the important things now. These lockdowns actually taught us what is important, and information, access to information is one of those crucial aspects that we need to make sure that in every single community, we have the resources that are needed for people to access information. Because once you have information, you are able to protect yourself, you're able to access at least the basic things, the very basic things that you need. One of the things that the Ministry of Health and Social Services has put in place, and the Ministry of Communication, Information Technology, they have put in place a daily update at a COVID Communication Center, which is based here in Windhoek, and this is broadcasted on radio and television every day. But again, it is people who have access to radio and television and smartphones and so on. So people who have multiple resources through which they can get access will remain better off than people who have limited access to information. And we should now invest into how do we make sure that everybody gets access to information by putting up information towers, even in the most remote places, by distributing material in a language and in a format that everybody can access, but by also, although something like COVID-19 came as a surprise, by addressing the issue of culture change, or the reasons why we need to wear a mask, the reason why we need to stop eating from one bowl instead of individual bowls and so on, because these are things that are challenging the normal way of doing things. And we need to explain to people why the normal in this particular case is not good for us. And I got the impression in some cases that people were just told, no more masks, no more big funerals, and no more sitting together and so on. And some people just didn't understand, why are you attacking the way we do things? And it really took some time for traditional leaders to step in. And I think that is one resource I've realized, that we need to use people on the ground, like traditional leaders, to convey the message, because they know the culture and they know what is needed to be introduced. So we shouldn't undermine actually the importance of local people on the ground providing information, but also making sure that we have all this towers and things that enable people to access information.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, thanks. Dr. Stephen?
You know, I think that here in the United States, the information issue isn't quite as important, I would say not important, but as much of a factor as it is in places such as Namibia or others that are less developed. The issues that I think, quite honestly, that this coronavirus COVID-19 thing is doing is it's awakening our tribal communities up to the fact that we need to reduce dependency on a number of different things. We too, like the indigenous people in Namibia, we too have a great dependence on tourism. Native art is a very important part of individual reservation economies. Is also a very large part of an American economy. $6 to $8 billion a year economy for native art. And tourism is big. We have tribal casinos, we have resorts, we have even the simple community that I live here doesn't have a casino, but we do have a place for people to sell their food for the tourists that drive through. We have stands that sell food. We also have an art show each year that was canceled this year, reducing the amount of money coming into the community. And so that that kind of dependence, and also the dependence upon the federal government, is something I think is going to be reassessed. There's a lot more people this year participating in traditional agriculture here in the Pueblo, and this, not just this Pueblo, but just about all of the Pueblos up and down the Rio Grande and out west. There's a lot of tribal communities talking about resurgences of tribal community gardens, family gardens, in order to reduce the dependency on outside food sources. I think that this is going to kind of begin to wake people up as to, like I said earlier, those things that are truly important, and start working for those things, as opposed to getting into debt and having struggles around things that maybe not that important. But so I can see that change coming. I don't see a whole lot of cultural change here, because we've changed a lot. Here in the United States, tribes have just changed tremendously. Right now, what we seem to be about is bringing back traditions and values and ways of living and ways of knowing that are more in line with our traditional values. And so this in some ways has provided a mechanism for reassessing where we stand and what we need to do to bring back some of those values.
Gotcha. All right. Thanks. We have a question from the audience and a member of the audience. Have either of you experienced misinformation about the pandemic being spread within indigenous communities?
I would say that outside of individuals misunderstanding something, not very much. We have a fairly robust and good health center here at Haihambo. And even within IHS, who serves most of the tribal communities, there's not much misinformation. I mean, I haven't heard of anything. I think that that intentional telling people something in order to undercut their response to COVID is not happening as far as I've seen, but I haven't, like I said, it's very hard to generalize on tribal communities in the United States.
Yeah. What about you, Cynthy?
Yeah, we haven't seen specifically misinformation amongst the indigenous communities, but in the mainstream, there were, for example, people spreading false information, maybe not intentionally, that, oh, there are now 10 new cases, and this put people to a panic mode. But it was, I think it has to do with a fear that people have towards COVID-19 and maybe not being close enough to the official formal information. And there was also in mainstream community an issue of stigma towards those people, because it's so few people who have tested positive for COVID-19 being isolated and rejected and so on. That was kind of in the early days, and we think we're seeing an improvement in that area.
Okay.
I want to quickly talk about what Prof. Stefan mentioned earlier about this reawakening of bringing back traditional practices and so on, that although we're seeing that happening also in Namibia, I think this whole issue of marginalization and minority issues have also caused the indigenous populations themselves, especially in the younger ages, not to appreciate their own values and knowledge that they have and so on. So although people want to know more about them, the younger people in those communities, some of them are ashamed of speaking their language and using their traditional knowledge, because somehow they were made to believe that that is backward and it's not important and so on. But there are groups that are becoming quite vibrant in terms of reigniting that kind of information and knowledge.
All right. So one thing that kind of, thanks for answering the question. One thing that I think for the to the audience actually asking the question as well. So one thing I'm just a bit curious about, Dr. Cynthy, is that you talk about like the mainstream, and then you talk about the indigenous communities. I'm wondering, like, that's Namibia, right? That's normally a sub-Saharan country. So how will you define who is indigenous and who is not? Because I would think that, I would guess that everybody here would think that, indigenous, like the entire country belongs to the Namibians themselves. So why are you making that distinction? Where is it coming from?
It comes from, okay, everybody is, even when the Department for Marginalized Communities was created, everybody was saying, but we are all indigenous. Yeah. But in our practices, you can clearly see that their populations, those key populations that do things differently, are kind of regarded as not dominant, as minority groups. And you won't see it in paper or in any policy and so on. The policy that we have in education, for example, we have an inclusive education policy in which indigenous communities, marginal, remote, rural indigenous communities are listed under vulnerable populations, together with persons with disabilities and children that become parents at an early age, children of farm workers, and so on and so on. So somehow in the social unwritten policies is that communities that are not following the mainstream way of doing things have started to be regarded, and even to regard themselves as indigenous, more indigenous than
Than the
others.
rest of the communities. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, got you. So we have a question from someone who says, how are non-dominant languages being used for messaging? This goes to
Yeah.
Dr. Stephen. Would you mind starting?
One of the things that I've noticed is that there's a number of PSAs that come out on our local television shows.
Yes, it's standing for what?
Public service announcements.
Okay.
That have come out in the Navajo language. And it's aimed specifically for those people living in and speaking Navajo and living on the reservation or near the reservation, or traveling back and forth between the urban area of Albuquerque and the reservation. Here within the Pueblo of Jemez, there's a lot of people speak the language, and so almost everything is done with the language. And again, I can't speak for beyond what I've seen and experienced in that regard, but we do have quite a number. You know, we've been getting these PSAs. We've been seeing other communities that I'm aware of have been doing something similar. A lot of tribes have radio stations, and they've been using their radio stations, using their tribal language there. Again, social media, but that's not using the tribal language.
Yeah. Same here. I think it's played a very important role in sending out messages in all local spoken languages, including sign language, which is delightful for us. And as I've said, also not only the issue of language, but also coining the message in such a way that it is suitable for children, it's suitable for the elderly, suitable for middle-aged people, and so on. So yeah, I think in that area we've done well, although as I've said earlier, there are places where people are not reached by radio and they have to rely on word of mouth.
Got you. And that's something that actually I've been kind of wondering about, right? Like the language. So how do you call coronavirus in the local language, right? So language, like what word do they use? How will you? I'm kind of just struggling with what will be the role now of researchers, let's say linguistics. What role can they play in making sure that the message is passed down to people in a way that they understand it, and let me say in the local way, I would say. So where do you see the role of researchers, coming into this, equation?
I think that this whole coronavirus thing has taken us back to where we were in the 80s, 90s with HIV and AIDS, where in the beginning people started referring to the disease without a name, and there would be a whole long description of what this disease is. And later, as people get used to what it is, then people just refer to the disease. Now, we're seeing people using also in the local languages COVID-19 with a description of what it is. And I'm sure with time, researchers will coin a name for, what coronavirus would be. I'm seeing that coming soon.
Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Stephen?
No.
Where do you see researchers kind of coming into play? And then before you even go to answer, our colleague here, Carol, she's saying that colleagues in Senegal have put online a sets of appropriate vocabulary in national languages. So she is sharing the link, and you can go in the chat and see it. But how do you see, and that's really a great resource. So how do you see where do you see the role of researchers, right, in helping, the community where you live in, not only to address, but also to address all the issues that you just kind of mentioned, talking about the resources, talking about communications, talking all those things. Where do you see researchers as the people who are in the audience now? Where do you see our role? Where do you see us coming into the equation?
That's a good question, because again, I keep going back to the fact that we can't really generalize about Indigenous people in the United States. Each community is going to be very, very different. And some tribes have land that is solely their own, such as here in most of the Pueblos and most of the Apache tribes. On the other hand, you go to other reservations where the reservation, because of historical processes, has perhaps more non-natives living on it than there are natives. And there's a challenge there in terms of a variety of challenges related to self-government, cultural resurgence. And there's some communities where there's no land at all. And they hold themselves together through language and culture, but they don't have any land. So we have this very, very broad spectrum of different kinds of land status, different kinds of ecological niches. We have a connection to urban areas, distance from urban areas. All of these things fit into that process. And for each different community, it's going to be different as to how and to what degree they decide that this is an opportunity to reassess and renew themselves towards bringing their tribe back together with some level of cultural integrity. For some, it won't be too hard. For some, it'll be almost unimaginably hard. So it's perhaps the place that we start off with, of course, is food. We need food every day. And as long as we're dependent upon grocery stores and industrial farming and industrial food production to give us our food, then our dependency is not upon ourselves, but upon those outside forces. And then once we're dependent upon them, then we put ourselves in a very vulnerable position. And I think that's being recognized by a lot of people. Tribal leadership here at Haihambo told people to come out and says, you guys need to get to the fields and plant this year. And huge numbers of fields that I haven't seen planted in years have suddenly have been turned over and plowed and have been planted. And we see this this kind of return to those traditional foodstuffs that's so important. That's probably the foundation of where you move forward from there to other areas, whether it's your own, housing, healthcare, education.
Really interesting, and I would say thank you for that as well. But and I feel like one of the common things that I'm finding among you guys, throughout our discussions, that definitely COVID-19 has caused people to kind of go back, within themselves and try to start thinking about going back into a cultural, traditional way of doing and local ways of doing and thinking, just to kind of address and protect themselves from that, for like that virus that kind of attacked each community. So in terms of kind of concluding, what would be maybe that I would say like kind of your final thought if you were to conclude our discussion right now here. So what will you say will be, if we were to think, I always think that, there's a good thing, there are two sides to everything, that they are bad and then they are good. So when you think about COVID-19 and in the community where you live in, what are the good things that you think COVID-19 has brought, to your community, and what are the negative things, and where do you see us going from there? And that would be kind of, except you have a question from the audience, but that would be kind of, concluding thoughts about, the experiences that each community that you present here have lived. So.
Okay, maybe Professor Stefan can start.
Yes, go ahead.
I think the good things that we've learned is we have realized our own value. And it is this whole issue of addressing the issue of dependency on supermarkets and so on. During the lockdown, for example, I've seen people starting to do things themselves, people working in the garden, people baking traditional bread and so on. And I thought, wow, we should have been doing this all along rather than taking the shortcuts we take. So we're also learning, there was a spirit of sharing information, donating things that we have. There were a lot of people that have donated items to indigenous communities, and a lot of people were saying, I've been keeping all these things in my house that I don't even use yet. Just on the other side of myself are people who need whatever items I have that I'm not using. So I'm saying that there are good things that we can invest on and that we can keep. A lot of people are talking nowadays about the new normal, and I hope this new normal will be a normal of sharing everything, information, food, skills, especially in order to make sure that we all survive, and not only the people who are in a high socioeconomic status surviving at the expense of the rest.
Stephen?
Well, it seems that this coronavirus thing is really presents a tremendous amount of threat to indigenous communities. Our indigenous knowledges are already very in a precarious position. We have a lot of we're losing people who have that knowledge, haven't passed it down, perhaps for a variety of reasons. But as dangerous as it is for our communities, it also has forced us to rethink a lot of things. When we had the lockdown, and you're not supposed to go anywhere, you can go out of my wife and I decided that we would go get our groceries once a week rather than once every 3 or 4 days. Well, immediately we started doing things around our house that needed to be taken care of because we were so involved in the rat race that we weren't taking care of things. And so, now, we've really focused on became a little bit more internalized, looking at what's important for us in our household, as opposed to chasing down, making sure I've got, whatever it is I want to buy this week or whatever it is I want to do this week, because it wasn't available. And that made us rethink things. And as we look at people going back into the gardens, as we see people going back to traditional foods, I think that this not only does it represent a tremendous threat, but it represents a tremendous opportunity to do something that can bring us back to understanding what's the most important things for our community and for our family, our community, and for the planet. There's, you saw I saw those great pictures on social media of pollution pictures from China and New York and all that, where in India, where suddenly the air is clear, and we know that it wouldn't take long to clean up the environment, but as long as we maintain this kind of industrial, consumptive-based society, we're going to have that kind of pollution. And the COVID-19 lockdown showed us that we could probably survive. We make a few changes in our economy and still do something good for the planet. So there may be some good come out of it. I've seen some good come out of it. I've also seen people, and I know people who have passed away, and I feel badly for them. I feel badly for their families because of the inability to participate in traditional mourning activities. But at the same time, there is an opportunity, and we have to look at it. We can sit down and we can focus on all the bad things that's happening because of it, and be like a whole lot of people rebel against the rules on masks and things like that out of anger towards the COVID or the government or whatever. But the reality is that we have to look forward as to what's going to happen now, and take a look at what's really good that's come out of this. And quite honestly, it may just be the indigenous people who see that, basic mainstream people who participate in the capitalist system fully, and that's where their hopes and dreams lie, may have some problems accepting that there's some good coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you for that. And with this, I will stop the recording, but I will leave time now for people in the audience. If you want to ask a question, you can hang out with us for a couple of minutes or even more. And then just want to say thank you for attending this webinar on COVID-19 and Indigenous communities. We had Dr. Stephen Wall from New Mexico, and then we had Dr. Cynthy Haihambo from University of Namibia, who were kind of discussing. And I was the moderator, the co-chair of the Indigenous Knowledge and Academia CEO of the CIES, Rebecca Bayek. And with that, I will stop the recording. I also wanted just to share with you the site that one of our colleagues, one of the Carol, just shared with us right now. And I just want to share that with the rest of the group to see what you guys, let me share it here with everybody and see, there you go. So just to say, I think it's really interesting to see what the colleagues in Senegal did. Okay, of course. Okay, this is in French. Sensibilisation autour du COVID-19, nos langues nationales participent. Okay, I think if I'm going to translate it, off my head, is like sensibilization around COVID-19, and then how our national languages are kind of contributing to that sensibilization. So sensibilization. There you go. So they have all right. So they're using retrouver les transcriptions des termes les plus utilisés. So they are using actually so the words that are mostly used, they are kind of transcribing them in the local languages. That is really interesting. So I think that was really good for us too. And thank you, Carol, for sharing this. It's really good. So here we go. All right. Okay. All right. I hope everybody was able to kind of, and with this, I will stop the recording and stop the sharing as well. And please hang out if you have questions or stuff you feel like.
So I'm very honored to be here to join this discussion today. I'm here in Oakland, California, the territory of Huichin, occupied unceded Ohlone territory, and just got back from waking up city council member Dan Cab, where we have asked him to defund the Oakland Police Department. It's been amazing to finally see people draw these connections between COVID and colonialism and the violence of the state and global white supremacy. I'm glad that the consciousness is growing, and the appropriate response is to throw these statues into the bay. And so it's nice to see that finally these things are, these connections are happening throughout the world. And my hope is that the conversations can grow for, greater healing and well-being for all people.
Mm.
You actually jumped in at the time where we're almost closing, and we were like, you know what, this is the time for us to kind of, find out folks and people who are, participants who kind of wanted to hang around with the speakers and say a few words. But just kind of be fair to you as well. I was just wondering, like, how has COVID-19, I know that you're working a lot. Tell us about your work actually with the Indigenous community, if you don't mind.
Yes, so I was born here in Ohlone territory, and I have spent a lot of time in my work as an artist. I work as a physician at UC San Francisco, where I'm a associate professor of medicine in hospital medicine. And I also am a musician and artist, and I've traveled around the world with my band, Rupa and the April Fishes, to places of where you can see the intersection between social discomfort, social upheaval, and physical ailments. And so really that inquiry through my music led to communities here asking me to stand with them against law enforcement violence back in 2016, as we were watching more and more people being shot by the police, as San Francisco was becoming gentrified. Through that work of accompanying Black and Brown community here in San Francisco, Indigenous community invited me out to Standing Rock to assist in the medical response when the Lakota people were standing for their right to not have a petroleum pipeline go through their water. And so as the state was becoming increasingly violent, Native folks there called me out to come and assist. And through that process of assisting, some of the grandmothers and healers asked me to help form a clinic to decolonize medicine. And so we've been working for several years now. We've raised over around $1.5 million, and we're raising more to form a permanent clinic in that territory, working with Lakota healers to decolonize medicine. And that's really become a central inquiry in my own work. Right now, I'm writing a book with Raj Patel, an amazing economist, agricultural policy person, we're writing a book looking at the health impacts of colonialism on the body, of our bodies, on our social body, and on the planet. I'm really drawing together the scholarship around climate collapse and these these uprisings we're seeing around the world. And COVID really draws everything into sharp focus. I think that if we had tried to get this book out a year ago, the world wouldn't be ready for it. But these ideas of structures that are making us sick, the bodies are responding to these disease structures, and that's where our illness is coming from. So we will be releasing that book. It's coming out on, I guess it's Macmillan in the United States, and then Penguin Press in the UK. And then we just got a interest from Japan to send it over there. So we're excited to help shape the global dialogue around how to build post-COVID in a way that really advances health and equity. Thank you.
Thank you. So please feel free now. I've been speaking, feel free to jump in and ask any of our panelists questions. Because I have a question, but I don't want to, I want to give a room for, people in the audience to kind of say something before I jump in. Don't be shy.
I guess I won't be shy. I'll ask a question. Dr. Marya, I wonder if you could touch a little bit more. I think you started, you mentioned a bit about this, but given that you're a medical doctor, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about just more specifically about how is, from your perspective, the COVID-19 is really impacting Indigenous community. I think you talked about in terms of, especially from your book, which I'm really interested in, about how a lot of the stuff that are just happening in our environment are really impacting us on so many different levels. But I would be interested in just more specifically from an Indigenous people, and how, what have you been seeing maybe in terms of hospital practices and how that is playing out?
So my colleagues have been to Navajo Nation to assist with the response there. I have not been there. I'm at great risk with COVID myself because my lungs were wounded at Standing Rock. They were spraying us all with chemicals, so a lot of people got really sick. But what we're seeing with Indigenous people, in your question, are you referring to Indigenous people in Turtle Island, this area, or in all over the world?
I guess yes, to both broadly and specifically in your experience.
So I feel like what we're seeing with, so Navajo Nation having the highest rates of COVID-19, very, very strongly impacted, shows not just the structural racism, so the structures of colonialism that have placed them into abject poverty, so much of the reservation with no access to running water, with environmental pollution from the uranium mining, the coal mining. So there's so many levels of the structures that have been imposed around Indigenous people that never existed before colonialism that that set up people for worse outcomes with COVID. But then also the cultural structures, so that communities exist in multi-generational interaction, and it's very rare to have, you know, if you're talking about sheltering in place, it's very hard for people to shelter individually because their families and their living are so much integrated. And so it feels like talking with some tribes up north in Canada, what they've done is they've just like blocked off their whole reserve. So they've just like locked it down. And I know they were trying to do that in South Dakota and gotten to like a power struggle with the governor around open highways, closed highways. But I really feel like tribes should have the sovereignty to shut things down as much as they need to in order to preserve the ability for families to be together and have a culturally relevant COVID response. They might need to, instead of shelter in place in individual families, shelter in place in communities. But we are seeing that they are harder hit. They're poorly resourced in the United States. So the least healthcare dollar expenditures have gone to IHS for years out of all the public programs. And then there's been the issue of PPE. So the federal government, when UCSF was putting orders in for PPE and other healthcare systems were putting in orders to China, let's say, for PPE, those stocks were being seized at the port of entry by FEMA. So the Jared Kushners of the world were seizing the PPE that private entities had ordered, including tribal groups, and then bringing them to states to auction off to the highest bidder, which to me feels like a real crime against, I mean, it should be investigated as a huge crime because it exposed so many more people than needed to be exposed. And most of the healthcare workers who have died, frontline workers, are Black and brown people in the United States. So there's so many levels of structural, I wouldn't call it dysfunction because it feels like it's functioning the way it was designed to function, which was to dispossess Black and brown and Indigenous people from their health and their sovereignty. So COVID just glaringly exposes the cruelty of colonialism and how the suffering of Black, brown, and Indigenous people is actually built into the structure of our society. I feel like the groups I've seen doing well are groups that are Indigenous groups that are really autonomously organizing and locking down their own communities.
Anyone else from the audience? From our panelists actually too. So just to kind of, you know, I wanted to ask a question, not only to you, Dr. Rupa, but also to anyone else. Like when you talk about decolonizing medicine, so what what is it that you have in mind? Because I heard you talking about, traditional healers and things like that. And I think this is true, be it in Namibia, be it. So what do you mean by decolonizing medicine? And it's really interesting to me because it's coming from, someone who's in the medical field. So I'm curious, what do you mean by decolonizing?
I feel like we have to start with understanding that the medicine that we learn as Western medicine practitioners was involved in the colonial project. So the advancement of medicine, as we know it in the 1800s, was used as a tool and often a justification of colonizing our lands. And so, often when the Europeans came to Africa and India and Turtle Island, Pacific Islands, they were confronting these diseases that they had never seen. And our people were living in balance with those diseases for thousands of years, that when the society was restructured through colonialism, those ecological balances, those social balances that kept those diseases in check, all were disrupted. In addition, our traditional medicines were looked down upon. We were thought to be uncivilized. And it was actually codified into Western medical teaching that our medicines were not scientific, not proven, and they became part of just degraded like everything else in our cultures, our religions, our way of dress, our way of speaking, our languages, everything. And that's part of the colonial project, is to devalue all the other ways of knowing outside of Western scientific thought or Western academic, the academic Western project. And so, I remember a French colonial general said that, if there was anything to justify colonialism, it was the doctor, the work of the doctor. And so it was seen as this, beneficent thing that the colonizers were doing to our poor uncivilized cultures, was to bring medicine. Unfortunately, they were bringing medicine that was to address the diseases that colonialism really exacerbated. And so to decolonize medicine is really to understand, I feel, that the health equity was never a project of medicine. It was never to centralize the health and well-being of colonized people. It was to keep the indigenous people well enough so that they could extract the resources for the colonial project, and to keep the colonizers healthy enough to continue to oppress Black and brown people. So if we don't understand the historicity and the power dynamics of medicine, we're not going to be able to really advance an agenda of health equity. So we have to really look inside the structures of medicine, how we accredit medicine, who is leading in our institutions of medicine, what they look like, what their priorities are. And so part of decolonizing medicine is a deeply anti-racist project, situating that within medicine. Because we see the outcomes in the United States, at least, around how medical racism is codified in the very structures of our institutions. And in order to, if we really are serious about health equity, and everyone's using that as a buzzword, they're fundraising for it, but they're not willing to disrupt the power structure that leaves Black and brown people out of the higher echelons of power of all these institutions. So part of it is reorganizing power structures, part of it is deeply anti-racist training, part of it is understanding and centralizing indigenous practices and cosmologies of health. Part of it is taking on a very deep aspect of understanding medicine as involving economics, environmental, like ecologies, all the ecologies that are surrounding the body, and in the body social and the individual bodies to uplift health. And so that's how, I see it as truly holistic health. And I think I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand, how to practice.
I hear you saying, I'm saying, accusing Dr. Cynthia. What are you saying?
No, I like you. I was also thinking, someone who's in the practice of medicine actually thinking about decolonizing. But this is what we have seen during the COVID-19 as well, that even in Namibia, in all communities, even in communities that were normally highly dependent on drugstores and pharmacies, were also resorting to the traditional ways of addressing flu or headache and so on. So this somehow, that link between us going back to what is ours before colonialism came to the fore. And I find that very interesting.
Dr. Stephen, any comment?
No, I just really appreciate what's been said today completely. You know, community health is really dependent upon a holistic vision of the community, not just this particular disease or this particular infection or whatever. We have to look at everything. We have to look at the economic structure. We have to look at, you know, the levels of colonialism within the community. We have to look at the levels of self-government within the community. We have to look at community cohesion, strength of traditions. All of these things are really, really important when we look at community health as opposed to individual health. Unfortunately, it seems that within the politicization of the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States, the focus has been on individual health as opposed to community health. Yeah. And the ability to look beyond just individual wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is lost upon people. They don't see the whole big sphere of how do we get to the point where people of color have such a negative impact from this pandemic, and what goes into those structural things that have created that kind of environment. But that may be just, you know, the way it's been for such a long time, that focusing on just the individual and not looking at the community as a whole. I've really appreciated this discussion. Everything that's been said has been enlightening, and it's also good to see that we share a whole lot in terms of our concerns and reactions towards this pandemic. I thank you for convening this.
I agree that the focus on the individual is a you know, such a great way to avoid things that are like populist uprisings, which what we're seeing right now across the United States. It's like the veil has been lifted, and I think that this is such a brilliant moment to really articulate the language of our communities and our wholeness. What's been beautiful, truly beautiful for me as a woman of color in the United States, is to see how many folks who identify as white showing up and just being like, this is too much. This is too much suffering. First COVID, and now the police violence, and just starting to understand. It's unfortunate that it has to come at the expense of Black lives. And I'm also grateful that people are showing up and defining relationships differently right now. And that is really the active site, I feel, of decolonization, is that when we form new relationships that are determined through our community bonds and not through some prescription of the state, that really doesn't want us mixing in these ways and discussing our power together, and just sharing ideas of popular power together. These are the powerful moments of, I feel like, creating new society, and I hope that with all the loss we've suffered with COVID, that can be the thing that lifts up those who are lost in greatest honor, is creating a new vision of how to be together that will make us more resilient in the face of what's to come, the climate shocks that are coming. So this is a great wake up, I feel.
Thank you for that. Anyone else from the audience wants to ask a question to our panelists? Nothing else? Everybody, it's been kind of definitely a wonderful conversation. I know, Dr. Rupa, you were feeling sad that you could not go, but I feel like even the couple of minutes that you spent with us were really important. Like kind of bringing that conversation in and thinking about it from a medical perspective, like a medical field, right? So having you come in and thinking about, decolonizing medicine and giving us that history that I did not know, and I don't know if anyone as the audience knew about how the colonizer used actually medicine, kind of keep keep the indigenous people or like down, and that kind of those power dynamics are really important. And I think you definitely need to know your history, where you're coming from, to know where you're going to go, right? So unless you know where you're coming from, then you're going to go make the same mistakes. And I think it makes me think about when the COVID-19 started coming up, countries around the world and indigenous community, people were coming with their own medicine concoction. And I do remember the thing with the president of Madagascar when he came up with I forgot the name of the medicine that he came up with, but it was a kind of traditional mixture that they use a tree. And then the WHO came up and kind of opposed and say it wasn't good enough. But you could see on social media how the people themselves were like, you know what, we don't care about you, WHO. We're going to use what, and some African countries, people were just buying and drinking just because, again, so seeing that. But we saw it, I saw it as being kind of, maybe people who claiming their identity, saying, hey, we matter, and then we do want to, we are people who matter. But seeing that from somebody from medical field who has gone through all this, and I think some of the comments I hear saying, hey, we're looking forward to your book, we're looking forward to read that, because I think it's really important, not only decolonizing our minds, knowing that what we have is definitely valuable, and then the way people have been treating themselves for centuries is definitely so important. So
I got really sick with my lungs,
yes.
Standing Rock, and I was sick for almost a year. And it was these indigenous women here in this territory who dragged me into a sweat lodge and prayed over me, and it helped so deeply. The ceremonies, I saw someone in the comments said their ceremonies are deep, and they operate on so many levels of our bodies to actually specifically address inflammation and trauma. And so we have so much rich heritage in our medicines, and we should absolutely use them and uplift them, especially in these moments of great challenge. So it's actually quite, I feel, an exciting time, not to throw out science and Western medicine, because it's there and there's great things from it, but to really create some humility in it and to open the door to what we don't know and to what other great traditions can offer the healing process.
Alternative, other ways, right, of knowing, of tweeting. We always think about, in the group, we always think about other ways of knowing, learning, but also we can add other ways of healing as well, right? Other ways of practicing medicine, and bringing that into the conversation is really important. So thank you again all, and for attending this webinar. As the Indigenous in academia, Indigenous knowledge in academia, I will see we have bi-monthly webinars. So this is our second. We're going to have a next one in August. So you will keep you posted. You receive emails from us. We're not going to overburden you with too many emails. So we're just going to say sporadically, saying, hey, this is something if you want to chime into the conversation. And with that said, I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for making the time. And one thing that's really interesting for us, that whenever we have this conversation, we always go over time. When we say 1 hour, it's never, because there's just so much that everybody wants to learn and wants to know about, the communities where you live, and then the different ways that people have been, practicing medicine and learning and doing things. So with that said, I would say thank you so much. I will stop the recording right now. I would say thank you so much.